Hi. So this thing has been sitting on my shelf for probably close to 3 years, unfinished. It has been used as a proxy before in a couple games, and I never really knew what I was going to do with it. It's made mostly of bath tissue soaked in white glue. There's some hot glue, some tin foil, some sticks I found in my yard, and I think plastic container from like some powdered drink mix as the base. I ended up trying a bunch of things I've never done before. Worked with some air dry clay, played around a little bit with a 3D pen, and never anticipated it would turn into what it did, but I'm pretty happy with it. It started out as a joke in the executive dining hall of the Kublai Collective Consortium, a food additive company situated in the industrial sector of megacity Aconcagua. It was a Friday, and Fridays were natural food days, when the higher-ups in the company were served real dairy and meat products, which were normally incredibly expensive and rare, and virtually never available to the average citizen. However, the Kublai Collective had some limited access to these luxuries. Due to the research that they did into artificial flavorings, fillers, and carbohydrate-rich substitutes, the company was fortunate enough to be currently in control of a biofacility located 200 kilometers outside of the city, where they perform genetic experiments on fauna and flora. Located in a deep canyon, heavily fortified and surrounded by fully automated motion-detecting plasma turrets, this wasteland oasis had its own natural water source, greenery, and low levels of radiation. There, they raised the livestock for their research. Two managers from the HR department were enjoying the day's fresh option of kidneys and cream and remarking to each other about how delicious it was and that they wished they could eat it every day, when they noticed Jeremiah Van Eck walking through the dining room. Jerry, as he was commonly known, was part of the research and development department and was definitely not an executive and definitely not permitted to be in the executive dining hall. Small, frail and meekish, his arms covered in scars, bald, with sunken pockmarked cheeks, sharp bird-like features, and a high lispy voice, Jerry was looked down upon by everyone at Kublai Collective. He walked with a noticeable limp, which was due to an abnormality at birth. It should have been impossible for somebody so physically unattractive to work at a major corporation, much less allowed to be in the building. But as part of a legal settlement arising from a workplace accident between Jerry's parents and Nova Life Services, the parent company of Kublai Collective Consortium, Jerry had been purchased at the age of 11 with a guarantee of lifelong employment. Instead of receiving cybernetic reconstruction and enhancement, which was a normal custom for any child as malformed as Jerry, as a cost-cutting method, Nova Life Services opted to just station him in the lowest level of the shipping and receiving department of its new fledgling subsidiary. There he toiled for close to a decade, in the bowels of the building, sorting samples, entering data, and performing otherwise mundane tasks. One day, when a quality control agent from the corporate offices was there for a routine inspection, she took notice of Jerry, and after the shock and revulsion upon seeing someone who, ideally, would have been euthanized long ago, or at the very least, would just be part of the urban rabble, relegated to a life of anonymity and obscurity in the slums of Aconcagua, where the dirty peasants lived, demanded that he be reassigned to another department so that she wouldn't ever have to encounter him again. As fortune would have it, there had been a recent outbreak of a new parasitic synthetic bacteria in the biological wing of R&D, and several employees had had to be liquidated, leaving them short-handed. So Jerry was transferred. He proved to be well suited to his new position. Though a pariah among his peers, He was eager to please and had no qualms about working with the newest breakthroughs in hazardous mutagens, radioactive isotopes, and other generally caustic compounds. He lived a solitary life of isolation outside of his work, retreating to his attic apartment every evening, where he slowly began to conduct experiments on the rats that he would capture near the dumpster of his building. He would steal chemical samples from work and inject the creatures or modify their food in an attempt to cause them to grow exponentially larger, thereby increasing their potential as a viable food source of real meat. He wasn't having much success with his experiments, but vowed to never give up. By his reasoning, if he could make a breakthrough, he might get a substantial bonus at work and finally be able to visit a Ripper doc to fix his limp with a bionic prosthesis, and maybe even buy himself a new face. A shining metallic face, just like a movie star. But all he ever accomplished was to make the creatures increasingly hostile and seemingly more intelligent. As he failed over and over, and it eventually became more and more difficult to dispose of all the rat carcasses, he had a thought and began to consume his failed experiments himself. At least it was real meat, he told himself. Why should it go to waste? He wanted to live like the rich and powerful, and it was delicious. So what if he started hearing voices, like echoes in the back of his mind, or began having vivid dreams where he was sure that he was seeing through the eyes of his subjects, only to awake and find them staring at him with malice from their cages. The Kublai Collective Consortium was not adverse to dealing in black market goods. No successful corporation was. One day, one of their underworld contacts approached their company contact with a strange, heretofore unknown substance that he had procured from one of the scavenger clans that roamed the wasteland. It wasn't clear where or how the sample was retrieved. It was contained in a small cryo cylinder that was covered in strange markings. It appeared to be quite old, possibly pre-war, and it seemed almost miraculous the container was still intact. After some preliminary testing, it was determined that whatever the liquid in the cylinder might be, it was definitely biological in origin and seemed to have some self-replicating properties. Much more research would need to be done in order to determine exactly what it was and how it behaved, but it could potentially be the key in cornering the market for affordable semi-organic edibles. While Jerry was free to move all about the research wing, it was fairly common that when he entered a room, other people would quickly exit the room, leaving Jerry alone. This was the circumstance that he usually took advantage of in order to steal the various samples from the lab for his nighttime experiments, and that's exactly what he did this time, putting a small amount of the purplish, pungent-smelling substance into a small vial and into his pocket. That evening, as he arrived home, he was almost shaking with excitement over this new sample and what he hoped he could accomplish. Sweating with anticipation, he entered the code into the security terminal on his apartment door and went inside. To his abject horror, he found an emaciated, hairless alley cat feasting on one of his rats. He had left the window open again, and the animal must have scaled the fire escape and knocked over the cage, causing the latch to open. He screamed at the cat, but the cat only hissed at him, blood frothing around its mouth. Jerry rushed at the cat to scare him off, but the cat, seemingly rabid in its aggression, lunged at Jerry, ripping and tearing with its claws. As the cat began biting and scratching at him, Jerry could do nothing to stop the attack. Then suddenly, as the cat was still firmly attached to Jerry's torn and blood-stained shirt, the attack stopped. The cat released its claws and dropped to the floor, staring at Jerry, its head tilted in a peculiar way as if to suggest sudden recognition in its eyes. Jerry's head began to feel like it was being squeezed from all sides. His vision began to contract until there was naught but 2 pinholes surrounded by blackness, and then nothing, and he collapsed to the floor. As he lay unconscious, he dreamed of eating. He was eating the rats. He was chewing and pulling on the flesh, the warm blood sliding down his throat. He smelled the musk of their fur, and he felt alive like he'd never felt before. He awoke several hours later. His arms were covered in dried blood. He could see scratches and bites, but he felt no pain. His stomach felt full. All of his rats were dead, strewn about the floor of his apartment, their bellies ripped open. But strangely, Jerry didn't care at all. The cat lay on its side several feet away, eyeing him pensively. Wordlessly, and somehow knowing that he didn't even need to speak, Jerry created a thought. He thought, "Come here, kitty." The cat immediately rose and approached Jerry, purring. Jerry had a friend. On this particular Friday, several months after Jerry's incident with the cat, a report on the substance that had been found in the wastes was requested by Miss Spindle, the head of marketing and coercion. Most everybody at Kublai Collective feared Miss Spindle. She was a demanding and impatient woman who was known to terminate employees for the slightest infraction, and she did not like to be disappointed. The report was unfortunately still inconclusive. It was found that while the substance could indeed attach itself to other cells and begin a process of rapid replication, it also altered and mutated the cells in unpredictable ways. It had not yet been determined how or why this occurred, and the very nature of the cellular structure of the substance remained a mystery. None of the researchers were willing to deliver this news. They knew that they would be risking their jobs if they presented such disappointing findings. So they gave the file to Jerry. Everyone disliked him already, so he could take the blame. But Jerry looked at it as an opportunity. He anticipated being seen as important and dependable enough to be entrusted with top-secret information. A reliable courier of some of the company's most closely guarded research. Palms sweating, Jerry got off the elevator on the executive level and went to the front office desk. Before he could even begin speaking, the receptionist turned her nose up in disgust upon seeing him. He nervously stammered out that he had a very important file that he had been instructed to hand-deliver to Miss Spindle. He was informed rather curtly that Miss Spindle was at lunch and that he was in no way, now or ever, authorized to be on this floor. As he began to walk across the cafeteria floor, everyone in the room fell silent, staring and whispering to each other. Things like, "Oh my God," and "I think I'm gonna be sick." He approached the table where Miss Spindle was sitting, surrounded by her small army of assistants. At first, she didn't even bother to look up. Too nervous to speak, Jerry just held out the file in his quivering hand. An aide to Miss Spindle snatched it from him and placed it on the table in front of her. She stared wordlessly at the folder for a moment before slowly reaching out and opening the cover. As she scanned the first page, the expression on her face began to change from aloof indifference to one of palpable rage. She muttered, almost to herself, "What the hell is this?" She looked up to see who had dared bring her this unacceptable report, and upon seeing Jerry, with his normally beady eyes now wide with fear, his avian-like face glistening with perspiration, she yelled out, "What the hell are you? And why the hell are you in my cafeteria?" She turned to one of her aides and said, "Call security immediately and get this disgusting thing out of my building." Jerry froze for a moment in shock. He was aware of Miss Spindle's reputation and was acutely aware of the revulsion that most people felt for him, but he had not expected this. He was supposed to have absolute job security. If the corporate warden department became involved, there was a very good chance that he may not make it out of the building alive. He'd seen others beaten, shot, and worse. He knew of a former employee from his days in shipping and receiving who'd been accused of insubordination and was never seen or heard from again. He turned and began to run as fast as his crippled leg would let him. He was almost to the exit of the dining hall when one of the two HR managers who had noticed him when he first entered threw what was left of his meal directly in Jerry's face, temporarily blinding him and causing him to trip and fall. The entire room immediately burst out into peals of laughter. The last things Jerry heard before the security bot began to jolt him with its plasma baton were, "Looks like you just got spindled," and chants of, "Spindled, spindled, spindled." When Jerry woke up in his apartment days later, he had no recollection of how he had made it home. He could only vaguely recall lying in an alley in a pool of sewage and seeing the night sky above him. Electrical burns now covered half of his body, and he was sure that at least one of his arms was broken. The cat, who Jerry had named Naglfar after something terrible and wonderful that he could barely remember from a childhood story, was curled up on the bed next to him, mewing and hissing. As his mind slowly cleared and the realization of what had happened, the beating that he took, his unemployment, and the taunts and humiliation he had suffered, Naglfar fell silent. As Jerry, in his shame, started to recall the indignities and cruelties that he'd suffered his entire life, he finally, after all those years, began to get angry. Naglfar started to purr. The angrier that Jerry got, the louder the purring got. An idea started to form in Jerry's mind. He still had that strange sample that he took from the lab. He had stopped conducting his experiments ever since Naglfar had entered his life, instead focusing on and strengthening the bond that they seemed to have for one another. He knew about the research facility located in that canyon. He knew that it would be easy for an animal as small as Naglfar to get past the security measures that were in place. It would be a simple thing to attach that purplish vial to his collar. Jeremiah Van Eck would have his revenge. He smiled to himself, while Naglfar's sandpaper tongue began to caress his face.